Glad you pulled out your pocket, Ronnie. You might need it for this one. We're going to be doing long division with trinomials. Do you remember in the days of elementary of long division? Okay, long division. This is a division symbol, not square root symbol. Okay, but let's go back to the world of numbers in elementary, where we had 489 divided by 3. We're going to use the same principles and the same steps using numbers in the world of algebra. Okay, so the first thing we did, we said 3 goes into 4 how many times? 1, and we wrote it right up above the 4. Then the next step we did was multiply. 1 times 3 is 3. We wrote it right under there. Then the next step we did was subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1. Bring 1 down, 18. Now we said 3 goes into 18. Went through the whole process all over again. We divided. 3 goes into 18 6 times. Then we multiplied. 6 times 3, 18. Then we subtracted, 0. Then we brought 1 down. Then we did it all over again. Divide. 3 goes into 9, 3 times. Now we multiply. 3 times 3 is 9. Now we subtract, and we have no remainder. Sometimes in the world of division, you could have a remainder. Okay? Sometimes you won't, sometimes you will. If you had a remainder, you would write it up here, write remainder of 1, 5, 9, whatever the remainder was. Okay? And this one, we didn't have a remainder, so you didn't need to write it. Now let's take these same principles and apply them over here to trinomials. So we're going to be taking x plus 3, dividing it into x squared plus 10x plus 21. Remember, the opposite of division is multiplication. What we're really asking ourselves is what times x plus 3 gives me this trinomial. We have learned that when you multiply a binomial to a binomial, you get a trinomial. So since we have a trinomial here, it is a good guess that our answer will be another binomial. A binomial times a binomial gives you a trinomial. So here's how we do it. Since we have 2 terms here, we are only looking at this x. So you can cover up this 3, cover up that 3, and say x goes into x squared how many times? Or what times x gives you x squared? What times x equals x squared? X times x gives you x squared. So x, because x times x is x squared. Since it's x, we write it over our x column. Here's our x squared column, here's our x column, here's our whole number column. So we're writing it over our x column, so we just divided. Okay, with numbers, what we do next is multiply. We divided, now we multiply. X times x gives me x squared. But we're going to multiply to everything. X times x gives me x squared. X times 3, we're basically distributing this x to everything over here. X times 3, a positive 3 gives me a positive 3x. Write your x squares in your x squared column, your x's in your x column. What was the next step when we dealt with numbers? We subtracted. So we subtract this whole thing. It is important to put parentheses around this because this subtraction sign needs to be distributed to this term and to this term. So once you distribute that negative, so this negative has to get distributed to this and this. So normally what I do, if I distribute this negative to this x squared term, that becomes negative. Now this 3x becomes negative. So I usually change that to a positive sign to show that I have dealt with it. That negative got distributed to that became a negative, this became a negative. Now I'm just basically adding, because this became adding. So your x squared minus x squared, those cancel, and they should. This first term should always go away. This 10x minus 3x, 7x. In the world, when you did it with numbers, after you subtracted, then your next thing was to bring 1 down. So we bring down that plus 21. Now we're back to dividing again. Okay? We say x, we're just looking at this first thing. We cover up the 3, and we say x goes into 7x how many times? Or if you want to think backwards, what times x gives you 7x? 7 times x gives you 7x, a positive 7. So this needs to be a positive 7. It gets lined up with my whole numbers. My whole number is over my whole number column. After we divide, we now multiply. 7 times x gives me 7x. 7 times a positive 3. A positive 7 times a positive 3 gives me a positive 21. Once you did this, your next step was subtract. That subtraction needs to be distributed to everything. So that becomes negative, that becomes negative. And then I write that there to show that I've dealt with that negative sign. So now your 7x and your negative 7x cancel. A positive 21 and a negative 21 does also cancel and equals 0. Therefore, we have a remainder of 0. So this right here, x plus 7, is your answer. And to check it, you go back and say x plus 7 times x plus 3 should give you what's under this division house. So to check it, we can say x plus 7 times x plus 3, and that should equal what was under our division symbol, x squared plus 3x plus 7x plus 21, x squared plus 10x plus 21, and it does check. Looking back up here to the world of numbers, if we check this, we're going to say 163 times 3 should equal 489. And then that's how you check it. Let's look at 24b, 9. Alright, so we're dividing. So the first thing you want to do is just usually you cover up this number right here. You divide x into x squared. X goes into x squared, or if you want to think of it, what times x gives you x squared? And x times x gives you x squared. And you write your x over your x column. So after you've divided, now you multiply. X times x gives you x squared. X times a negative 2. Remember, the sign in front of the number goes with the number. X times negative 2 gives you a negative 2x. Keep up with your signs. After we multiply, we now subtract. This negative needs to be distributed to everything. So this becomes a negative times a negative becomes positive, and then I just write that as a positive to show that I've dealt with it, and now I'm just basically adding. X squared and a negative x squared, or x squared minus x squared, they cancel to be 0. These first terms should cancel. A positive 1x and a positive 2x, this is now a positive, is a positive 3x. After you subtract, the next thing to do is bring 1 down. Now we're at dividing again. Remember, you're looking at x into 3x. You're doing the first into the first, always. So you can cover up the 2, the negative 2. X goes into 3x how many times? Or if you want to think of it, what times x gives you 3x? A 3 times x gives you a 3x, a positive 3. So now we multiply. Positive 3 times x is a positive 3x. A positive 3 times a negative 2 is a negative 6. Now we subtract that whole thing, put that whole thing in parentheses, because that negative has to get distributed to everything. So that becomes a negative times a negative becomes a positive, and then I do that to show that I've distributed my negative. Now I'm adding a 3x and a negative 3x, cancel. A negative 6 and a positive 6 also cancel to be 0, which shows I have a remainder of 0. There's no remainder. So this is your final answer. And you can check it by saying this times this should be what's under the division symbol. So we can say x plus 3 times x minus 2 should equal what's under our division symbol. If we FOIL this out, x squared minus 2x plus 3x minus 6. Adding our like terms, x squared plus 1x minus 6, and that is what's under our division symbol. So x plus 3 is the answer. Okay, now we're looking at 24D1. We're going to be dividing x plus 1 into this trinomial. So again, we cover up the 1 and we're doing x into 2x squared. Be careful, this x squared now has a coefficient on there. So x into 2x squared, or what times x gives me a 2x squared? Well, we for sure know that x times x will give me an x squared, but now we need to have a 2 on there, because 2x times x will give me a 2x squared. Now we multiply the 2x times the positive 1, which would be a positive 2x. Now we are ready to subtract that whole thing. Distribute this negative to where that will be negative, and this will become negative. Now we are adding 2x squared, or subtraction, it's the same thing. You're adding positive and negative numbers. So when you say adding and subtracting and you're done with positive and negative, it's like the same thing. So 2x squared and a negative 2x squared, they cancel. A negative x, which is a negative 1x, and a negative 2x is a negative 3x. Keep up with your signs. Now you bring one down. Now you're back to dividing. So you look at, you cover up your 1, x into a negative 3x. What times x gives me a negative 3x? Well, this x is positive, so therefore this number has to be negative. A negative 3. Line it up over your whole number. A negative 3 times a positive x will give you a negative 3x. A negative 3 times a positive 1 gives you a negative 3. You have to keep up with your signs. Now you are subtracting everything. This is really important. This subtraction has to be distributed. A negative times a negative is a positive. That becomes positive. A negative times a negative becomes a positive. So then I make that positive. A negative 3 and a positive 3, they cancel. A positive 10 and a positive 3 is 13. This just means you have a remainder, because you can't divide x into 13. Nothing times x will ever give you 13. Anything you times by x will always have some sort of x in it. Okay, so this tells you you're done, and you come up here and you write remainder 13. And this is your answer. And this is how you check with the remainder. You still say this binomial times this binomial. So to check, you say the 2x minus 3 times your x plus 1. Foil that out. 2x squared plus 2x minus 3x minus 3. Combine your like terms. 2x squared, a positive 2x, and a negative 3x is a negative 1x. When you get to this point, now you add on your remainder. Okay, so now you add on the remainder, say plus 13. So 2x squared minus x, a negative 3 and a positive 13 is a positive 10, and therefore you get what is under the division symbol, and it checks. Okay, let's move on to 24E1. So we have a coefficient in front of our x squared, but we also have a coefficient in front of this term as well. But you do it the same way. The process is still the same. Cover up this number. You're dividing first. 2x into 2x squared. In other words, what times 2x gives you a 2x squared? You can think of it like this. 2 divided into 2 is what? 1. X into x squared is just x. Double check yourself. X times 2x does give you a 2x squared. X times a positive 2 gives you a positive 2x. Now you are subtracting everything. This negative gets distributed to each thing. So this becomes a negative, this becomes a negative. A negative times a positive, negative times a positive. Now 2x squared and a negative 2x squared, those both cancel. A positive 10x and a negative 2x gives you a 8x. Bring one down. Now you're back to dividing again. So you cover up this 2. 2x goes into 8x. The first by the first. Divide the first into the first. 2x goes into 8x, or what times 2x gives you 8x? That would be a positive 4, because a positive 4 times a 2x gives you a 8x. A positive 4 times a positive 2 gives you a positive 8. Now you subtract everything. This negative gets distributed to each term, so that becomes negative, that becomes negative. These cancel. A positive 8 and a negative 8 also cancel, becomes 0, so you have a remainder of 0. You can go back and FOIL this out. Since there's no remainder to add on at the end, your remainder is always added on after you FOIL. There's no remainder, so you just FOIL these two out to check. X times 2x, 2x squared. X times 2, positive 2x. 4 times a 2x, positive 8x. Positive 4 times a positive 2, positive 8. Combining like terms, then you do get what is underneath the division symbol. Okay, the last problem we're going to look at is 24b10. You can see now we don't have a trinomial. We have a polynomial with 4 terms. I don't know if there's a specific name for that, but it's a polynomial, it has 4 terms, but you work it the same way. You cover this up and you say x into x cubed. What times x gives you x cubed? X squared would. So you can see x squared times x is x cubed. You write it over your x squared column. So now you multiply x squared times x, x cubed. X squared times negative 2 is a negative 2x squared. Now you're ready to subtract. That subtraction has to get distributed to everything. So that becomes negative, and negative times a negative becomes a positive. X cubed and a negative x cubed cancel out. A negative 5x squared and a positive 2x squared is a negative 3x squared. Now you bring one down and you go through the whole process again. Cover up the negative 2, x into negative 3x squared. What times x gives you a negative 3x squared? Well, you definitely know it's got to be negative. Negative 3, negative 3x. A negative 3x times x gives you a negative 3x squared. A negative 3 times a negative 2, negative times negative is a positive. 3x times 2 is 6x. Now you subtract that whole thing. Negative times a negative, that becomes a positive. Negative times a positive, this becomes a negative. Negative 3 and a positive 3x squared, those cancel out. A positive 11x and a negative 6x is a positive 5x. Now you bring one down, bring down that negative sign. The sign in front of the number goes with the number. So that is a negative 10 to bring down. Go through the whole division process again. X into 5x, or what times x gives me 5x? A positive 5. Positive 5 times x is a positive 5x. Positive 5 times negative 2, negative 10. Now you subtract this whole thing. This negative gets distributed to this. Negative times a negative becomes a positive. 5x minus 5x, 0. A negative 10 and a positive 10, 0. So there's no remainder. This is your answer. The book doesn't ask you to check it, but I'm going to show you on the video how to check it. This is not a binomial times a binomial, so you cannot FOIL it. Okay? I'm going to write this one first. X minus 2 times x squared minus 3x plus 5. Multiplying this should give me back what was underneath the division symbol. When you have a binomial times a trinomial, you're just distributing everything. Take this x and distribute it to every term. So x times x squared, x cubed. X times a negative 3x, negative 3x squared. X times a positive 5, positive 5x. Then what you do is take the negative 2 and distribute it to every term. Negative 2 times x squared, negative 2x squared. Negative 2 times a negative 3x, positive 6x. Negative 2 times a positive 5, negative 10. Now you combine like terms. There are no other x cubes. That's the only x cubed. We took care of that one. Here's an x squared term, here's an x squared term. X squares can only be combined with other x squares. You have a negative 3 and a negative 2, which would be a negative 5x squared. I took care of those. Now combine my x's together. A positive 5 and a positive 6. Positive 11x. I took care of those. And negative 10 is my only whole number. And that is exactly what was underneath the division symbol that we started with. So that checks. So your final answer was x squared minus 3x plus 5.